Everyone thinks they know how Red Lobster died. The shrimp, the all-you-can-eat shrimp deal that customers supposedly ate into oblivion. It's become a punchline, a meme, the story of a restaurant so generous it gorged itself to death. But that story is a lie, or at least it's a cover for something far darker. Because Red Lobster wasn't killed by hungry customers chasing endless shrimp, it was killed in a boardroom by a deal most of its diners never heard about. This is the real story of Red Lobster. How a man brought fresh seafood to Middle America, how it became a beloved national icon, and how, decades later, it was quietly gutted from the inside by the people who were supposed to own it. It begins in 1968 in Lakeland, Florida, with a restaurateur named Bill Darden. Darden had a genuinely big idea. Back then, fresh seafood was something you got on the coast, at nice restaurants, for prices most families couldn't afford. If you lived inland in the middle of the country, you might go your whole life barely tasting it. Darden looked at that gap and saw a mission. He wanted to bring seafood to the landlocked, to make it affordable, casual, and available to ordinary Americans who'd never had access to it. So he opened a seafood restaurant and called it Red Lobster, and people loved it. The idea was so good, so obviously needed, that it caught fire almost immediately. It caught fire so fast that within just 2 years, it drew the attention of a giant. In 1970, of all companies, the cereal company General Mills, the people behind Cheerios, bought Red Lobster when it was just a 5-restaurant operation. And with that corporate muscle and money behind it, Red Lobster exploded. Through the 1970s and 80s, it spread across the country, eventually peaking near 700 restaurants. It became a national institution. For millions of families, Red Lobster was where you went to celebrate. A graduation, an anniversary, a birthday, payday. It wasn't fancy, but it felt like a treat. It was the place you got to feel a little fancy without breaking the bank. And it gave the world some genuinely iconic things. The endless shrimp promotion. And above all, those Cheddar Bay biscuits, warm, garlicky, buttery, the kind of thing people would happily fill up on before the meal even arrived. People didn't just like those biscuits, they loved them with a fierce, irrational loyalty that most brands can only dream of. In 1995, General Mills spun off its restaurants into a brand new company, and they named it in honor of the man who started it all, Darden Restaurants. Red Lobster was its crown jewel. For a while, life was good. But the seeds of the disaster were planted in what came next, and to understand it, you have to understand one boring-sounding thing that turns out to be the whole story: who owned the buildings. For decades, Red Lobster owned its own real estate. It owned the land and the buildings its restaurants sat on. That's a huge hidden strength. It meant the company didn't pay rent. Those buildings were assets, a foundation of stability worth a fortune. Then, in 2014, Darden sold Red Lobster off to a private equity firm called Golden Gate Capital for around $2.1 billion. And this is the moment the knife went in. Most people just never saw it happen. Here's the maneuver. To help pay for the very purchase it was making, Golden Gate immediately turned around and sold off Red Lobster's real estate, the land and buildings under hundreds of locations, to a separate real estate company for about $1.5 billion. In one move, they recouped most of what they paid. But think about what that did to Red Lobster itself. The company that had owned its buildings and paid no rent suddenly owned nothing and had to rent its own restaurants back. It was now a tenant in the very locations it used to own, locked into long-term leases, 25 years, with the rent automatically climbing every single year. This is called a sale-leaseback, and for Red Lobster, it was a slow-acting poison. The company had been stripped of its most valuable asset and saddled with a permanent, ever-growing bill in its place. By 2023, Red Lobster was paying around $200 million a year in rent, roughly 10% of all its revenue, much of it on properties priced above market rates. Money that could have gone into better food, renovated restaurants, or fighting off competitors was instead bleeding out the door as rent every month, forever. Red Lobster was now running uphill with a weight chained to its back, and that weight got heavier every year by design. Meanwhile, ownership kept shifting. A giant seafood supplier called Thai Union, one of Red Lobster's own vendors, bought in starting in 2016 and eventually became the majority owner. Think about that conflict for a moment. One of the company's main suppliers now controlled the company that bought from him. They kept cutting costs, but they could not fix the fundamental problem, because the fundamental problem was that crushing rent bleeding the company dry. And this is where the famous shrimp comes in. In 2023, desperate to put people back in seats, Red Lobster made its $20 ultimate endless shrimp deal a permanent, everyday offer. And yes, customers feasted. The company lost around $11 million on it. But here's the truth. The memes get wrong. $11 million against a company drowning in something like $1 billion of debt and $200 million a year in rent was a drop in the ocean. The endless shrimp wasn't the cause of death. It was a symptom, a desperate gamble by a company already mortally wounded by financial engineering. Blaming the shrimp is like blaming a cough for a disease that was killing the patient all along. In May of 2024, it finally happened. Red Lobster filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The iconic seafood chain that Bill Darden built to feed Middle America was broke. Dozens upon dozens of locations went dark, their doors locked, their dining rooms emptied, in cities all over the country. For countless people, a Red Lobster they'd celebrated at for years simply vanished. The chain did survive the bankruptcy. It emerged under new ownership, smaller, leaner, trying to engineer a comeback and win back the customers who still have a soft spot for those biscuits. But it's a shadow of the empire it once was, and it's still closing locations as it fights to find its footing. So the next time someone jokes that Red Lobster ate itself to death on shrimp, you'll know the real story. This wasn't a tale of a restaurant that was too generous. It was a tale of a healthy, beloved, asset-rich company that got bought, stripped of the very buildings that made it stable, and bled dry by rent while its owners pulled their money out. A bad real estate deal killed Red Lobster, not a bad meal deal. And that's the part worth remembering. Sometimes the thing that destroys a great company isn't its food, its customers, or its competition. Sometimes it's the people who buy it, take it apart, and walk away with the pieces, leaving an empty shell where an icon used to be. If you enjoyed this story, smash that like button, subscribe for more business stories like this one, and tell me in the comments, how many Cheddar Bay biscuits could you really put away? I'll see you in the next one.